Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to our webinar, Reimagination, How Businesses Prepare for Post-COVID-19. We're going to be looking at this from a risk management perspective, and we'll be guided by the ISO 31000 standard. Welcome to everybody, depending on where you are in the world. Today, it might be morning for you. I am speaking to you out of Kampala, Uganda. Very good weather here for a change after a long time. And I look forward to having a great day with you. My name is Kilian Songwe. I am the president at the Global Healthcare Public Foundation, with a lot of experience working around standards and doing policies and development programs for different countries and institutions. And the Global Healthcare 18-year organization around the globe, working on at least 3 continents, helped a lot of institutions to get to institutional certification. So just to be able to get started on this webinar today, as I said, I want to do this with the ISO 31000 in the backdrop. So I want to compare this to ISO 9001. ISO 31000 again is basically, it's a management standard, but it's different from the other management standards because this management standard actually just provide guidelines on how to go around risk management. So when you look at the ISO 31000 and the ISO 9001, just from a structural point of view, you realize that ISO 9001 has 10 different clauses starting off with the scope. All the ISO documents generally start off with the same 3 things: the scope, the normative reference, terms and definitions. All ISO documents start off from them. However, the ISO 31000, which is the risk management guidelines document, goes on with 3 additional new clauses, which is risk management principles, the risk management framework, and the risk management processes. For the purposes of today's discussion, I'm not going to spend much time on the principles or the framework because I want to talk about how businesses should look at their risk and how to prepare for the post-COVID period, which is just about now for most countries in the world. So I will spend a little more time on the risk management processes. So risk management by definition. What is risk management by its own definition? According to ISO 31000, risk management is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And an effect is either going to be positive or negative. And these deviations actually help you in terms of, if it's a positive deviation, yes, you will like positive deviations because it means there are gains that have been made. If it's a negative deviation, it means there is a loss that has been made. There is an actual. Talking about risk management, we also look at compliance. That's the ISO 19000. The ISO 19600 looks at compliance. And basically with that particular standard, what we are looking at there is basically saying, what are you going to do to be able to protect your value chain? And basically, I have 2 things here that are of interest. When you protect your value chain using risk and compliance, there are some things that are actually going to come out which are very important to you. Productivity, efficiency, growth margin, profits, sustainability, the reputation of the organization, quality, safety, and then of course you want your clients to be able to trust you and be able to do business with you more often. So that becomes really important as you do this. So now, going forward, what you have here is looking at the risk and what the risk stages. Basically, there are 3 very clear stages when you're there is somebody in the house who's not muted. Risk management would be stage 1. Basically, what happens at risk management? Do we have and can we keep our staff? You're looking at how you're going to keep the doors open. There is the worry of being closed. Is your business going to stay open? Are you going to be able to sustain the challenges, the devastation that is happening? Stage 2 on the risk stages is risk management. This is crisis stage normally, what risks really matter? You want to be able to find out what is it that is actually going to keep you in business. What risk can you buy down? And what risk can be merged? You're actually at this stage beginning to say, how do we stay in business? And then finally, in the 3 stages, there is the change management. What is the next normal? Which is where a lot of us are today. A lot of businesses are wondering what they are going to look like when they open. How do we get there? How do we measure the progress that we plan to make? So, as I said earlier on, I want to specifically look into the area of 6.4, which deals with the risk management. And so there's some very simple terminologies that we have to look at. It says conduct systematic risk assessment on regular basis. So in the standard ISO 31000, under clause 6.4.1, it says assess the risk that could influence the achievement of your objectives. For you to be able to assess them, you need to identify the risk. And identify the risk that could influence the achievement of your objectives. The processes used to find or recognize the risk. And in 6.4.3, it talks about analyze the risk that could influence the achievement of your objectives. And in 6.4.4, it says evaluate the risk that could influence the achievements of your objectives. I want to be very clear here because it uses the phrase of objectives, because your risk is going to influence your objectives. Are you going to be able to attain the objectives as set? If you are not able to attain the objectives as set, then you are going to go into a negative risk. If you can, and you can surpass them, then that becomes a positive risk. So, risk assessment is a process that is made up of 3 separate processes: risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. And I spend a lot of time on these 3 things because it is really the crux of the whole risk assessment and risk management evaluation. So just getting into it, you need to think about what is the context of your organization. Once you appreciate the context of your organization, then you can now filter down to figure out what are the risk identifications that have to be made, the risk analysis, the risk evaluation, then risk treatment. We're going to spend some time on risk treatment because it is relatively important. Feeding into the context, identification, analysis, and evaluation, as well as risk treatment, is how is the communication going to be done, and what are the consultations that you would do to ensure that these things happen, and how would you monitor all of this as it goes on. So talking about where we are today, there are 3 very important stages that I would use to be able to look at the risk management perspective and preparing businesses to go back. Number 1 is the pandemic. That's COVID-19. That's where we are, and that's what the conversation is about today. So you look at the risk stages that we have. The pandemic came about in March. Then shutdowns. A lot of the businesses were shut down. And then the impact to be able to allow us to be able to move forward. So I put this side by side so that we can actually look at it closely. Then there is the pandemic. So most people would never have identified the pandemic as a risk, but hopefully they might have identified a disaster of a certain potential. And if you had actually identified a disaster of a certain potential or a certain magnitude, then you have to actually go in and analyze your behavior when that disaster actually comes into effect. Once that analysis is done, then there's going to be an evaluation to make a determination of, is the identified risk, is it going to be acceptable? Would you be able to continue business? That would be answer A. Or answer B, if that risk is unacceptable, then what is your response? What is the contingency plan that you put in place when you did your initial identification of risk and you found out that there was a potential disaster? In this case, it's COVID. What did you put in place to be able to ensure that your business continues to go on? So moving on to preparing for post-COVID, just before we got into the COVID world, December of 2019 into January of 2020, business, the old normal. You got up in the morning, you went to work. Those who went to work in the afternoon, they did the same. And those who went to work on the third shift, it was basically business as usual. So it was the old normal. But moving from the old normal into what we want to reimagine now is chaos. So as we moved from the old normal, we went into shutdowns. And a lot of the businesses were not prepared for the shutdown. So instantly they went into chaos. They tried to figure out, what are we going to do with staff? Some people laid off staff, they shrunk, all kinds of things happened. But this was chaos to the business community. What were the banking hours? What was the liquidity available to the different businesses? This was a very big concern. And I drop in the reimagination and the ISO 3000, 31000, as well as compliance. Because between reimagination using ISO 31000 for risk management and using the ISO 19600 for compliance, when you bring those two things into place with a proper structure, then you are able to move into the new normal. So you move from the old normal, you move into a period of crisis, that's the shutdown, and then you reimagine your business, and then you go into what is going to be the new normal for a lot of businesses. So, resumption plan. At what stage is your business today? So some people have a plan that has been implemented, tested it before. Some people have a plan that they've developed. Some people are just beginning to start to develop a resumption plan. And there are some organizations that they have nothing in place yet. They're waiting, and they're going to continue waiting until everybody goes back to business. Then they'll be, oh, okay, we can go back to business. Who is leading? Who's leading your resumption plan? So for some organizations, it's the chief executive officer. For other organizations, might be their compliance officer. In some bigger organizations, they created crisis teams or task force. In some organizations, they have just a committee. And if it was just a mom and pop shop, then no one. There's just one person running the business. So that one person is responsible for ensuring that they're leading the resumption plan. Okay, so I throw this in because it's important. What's your risk attitude? What's your organization's risk attitude? So an organization's risk attitude defines its general approach to risk. And that general approach actually allows you to say, are you going to take the risk? Can you tolerate it? Can you retain it? Do you want to share it, reduce it, or you just want to avoid it completely? So those are the kinds of things that you have to look at when you're talking about your risk attitude. Then going on, it says, an organization's risk management plan describes, very importantly, how it intends to manage risk. So you need to have a plan going before we got into this stage. There needed to have been a contingency plan. What are you going to have in place to continue to run your business? So in that contingency plan, basically you're going to ensure that it describes what are the management components to it, what approach are you going to use to ensure that your business continues, and what are the resources that are available. So the risk management plan can be applied to products if you're just producing a product, to processes in your business, or to projects. It could be a single project that is going to be affected, but for most cases, to the entire organization. So I dropped this out there, address risk that really matters. So you need to be able to identify your risk. And then once you've identified your risk, the next important thing is to prioritize your risk. So you know what risk absolutely need to be addressed, and addressed in a timely fashion so that you can keep your business going. So risk context. Context here means the external and internal parameters that organizations must consider when they manage risk. And of course, no business is going to be functioning in isolation. And so there are different contexts that we need to look at. So if you're looking at the external context, you're looking at your local environment. What is going on in your local environment? In the case of Uganda, where I happen to be at the moment, you move from one lockdown period to another lockdown period. And then it could possibly get extended. You need to be able to appreciate what is going on in your local environment, what is happening nationally, what is also going on internationally would your business environment, specific objectives for which you do business. Then, of course, there is the business itself. There are the things that are going on internally. Who are your internal stakeholders? What kind of governance approach do you have to how you keep your organization functional? Contractual relationships. What are the contracts you have? Are you going to be able to suspend some of your contracts because you're not doing business? Or are your contractual employees, are they able to continue to conduct business? What kind of contractual relationships do you have? What are the capabilities? What's the culture and standards that have been set by your organization? So looking at some of this, basically where we go to from here now is, what to consider. What are the things you want to consider as you do your risk management for your business? What has been the impact of COVID-19? So you might have staff that have health issues. There might be issues with your supply chain. There might be issues with you being able to place demands, or just your basic operation might be affected. Your employees have the right to refuse to come back to work if they think that the workplace is still unsafe. That's a big risk for you, because now it looks into the competencies of the staff that you have. What obligations do you have and when are they due? And in some cases, if you defer some of your obligations, then you get hit with a bigger penalty. Your interest rates will increase. Reduction in your workforce. Reduction in your workforce is a consideration which you must have, because again, as I said earlier on, you might have different competencies in your staff, and so you want to ensure that a reduction in workforce still allows for good production to happen. Business assumptions that have been challenged. There is also going to be consideration of remote work. Now you have staff working from home. Shift social distances. How much space how much additional space would you need? Then, of course, new safety guidelines, new sanitization, washing of hands, all of those. How many times is the business environment going to be cleaned? Those are considerations that are actually acute to the functioning of your business. So, with the pandemic today, I'm looking at primary risks that have affected businesses today and how they're going to be able to prepare for post-COVID. So the pandemic, March 11th, then we move into the shutdown. For most of the African countries, they started, I think Nigeria was one of the first in the last week of February, all the way down to Lesotho. Lesotho actually did a shutdown in the end of March. So there were all kinds of reactions to the pandemic. And finally, you have impact. So we have three different risk areas that I want to look at. First of all, there is the pandemic, then there is shutdown, and then there is impact. And all of them present some level of risk. So let's start with the pandemic. So the first thing that the businesses had to deal with was infected persons. How many of our staff are going to be infected? How much infection is in the countries where we do businesses? Is the virus sitting on surfaces? How do we change our hygiene practices? Then, of course, when you think about all of those are some of the uncertainties that you have to deal with. And remember, in the definition for risk, we spoke about uncertainty having an effect on your objectives. So when you think about infection of staff or the virus sitting on different surfaces or the hygiene of the staff, of course, it has a direct impact to the consequences that you have is loss of life. You have either symptomatic or asymptomatic staff or patients or visitors to your business, and then you have an economic slowdown because there is going to be loss of life. So from a business perspective, and to a large extent from a national perspective as well, there have been a lot of preventive actions that have come into place. So there's been more hand washing. People have been asked to isolate themselves if they don't feel very well, social distancing, and then the economic shutdown, just to be able to reduce traffic and reduce potential for new infections. And this whole area of prevention is what has led us to the famous flattening of the curve. When we talk about flattening of the curve, which is going to become part of our new terminologies as we go forward. But then how do you mitigate some of these consequences? You could either go into quarantine, you could have your staff go into quarantine, you could have a policy that allows you to support your staff while they're hospitalized, or how do you reverse the consequences from the pandemic? Then the next big thing following the pandemic itself and its effect on business is the shutdown. This presented a major crisis to a lot of businesses. It happened in most countries abruptly. So uncertainty, outcome, it has a direct effect on the objectives that were sought to be attained. So the uncertainties here were safety measures. What kind of new safety measures need to come into place for the business? Those are things that need to be measured by the different business places. Economic shutdown, what does it mean? What is the risk for you shutting down your business? Reduction of workforce. If you need 1,000 people to be able to produce the things that you produce, because of social distancing, reduced workforce, it means you're now most probably going to take, your lead time becomes longer for you to deliver the same product. That certainly is a risk for your business, depending on the competition in which you are in. But then, of course, what are the consequences of this, the threats in this case? There's loss of business, because this was crisis management time, shutdown. So some businesses are just going to fold. Loss of livelihood. There is a farmer who has made his whole life in supplying tomatoes, for example, to the hotel industry. And today, all the hotels are closed. Instantly, his livelihood is put into question. Personal finances. The big threat to the crisis has been loss of business and a lot of loss of livelihood. This is what people are going to have to deal with as we come back from, we recover from the pandemic. Prevention for this set of uncertainties, actually there is no prevention for this. But in terms of mitigation, yes, a lot of the countries have looked up to government to provide some kind of support, whether it be it in food or in checks to be able to allow the families to move on. Family support. Family support is always very important. Counseling, reach out to counselors, new businesses. A lot of businesses have found this as a perfect opportunity. And again, this is one of those times when you do a risk assessment, and it's not a negative risk assessment, it's actually a positive risk assessment. And they've been able to diversify into new industries. Then, of course, as I said, there are three things. There was the pandemic, the shutdown, and then the impact. So coming to the impact, in the first stage, when we looked at what was going on, there was loss of life, loss of business, and loss of livelihood. Preventive controls were put in place, mitigative controls to deal with the consequences of the loss of life or business or livelihood. But then the impact of COVID itself, after moving from that impact, basically where we find ourselves now is better life. So people's hygiene has most probably improved. Businesses are better. Those ones that have come back, those ones that had a good risk management plan in place are able to come back. The livelihood of those staff are going to be better. However, we still need to have controls to enable and support the better life or the better business or the better livelihood, and be able to exploit the controls that have been put in place, because again, the whole idea here is risk management. How do we exploit what we've put in place today to be able to avert a potential future pandemic or any event that could affect our business? So, talking about uncertainty, how much uncertainty do you have? Basically today, we have two things that are going on. We have the old normal, which I call order, and then we have where we are today, which is chaos. People literally trying to find out, are we going to restart? Are we going to open up? What is going to happen to our business? But when you look at the past and where we are as we plan to go forward, risk management comes right at that point where you move from order to chaos. Because it's right at that point where you come in to protect, risk management comes in to protect the border so that you don't go over. You can actually continue to do business the way you're supposed to do business. Compliance issues are taken into consideration and you don't end up in chaos. So risk management is pretty important. You need to have a risk management plan when your business is still functioning properly. So, level of uncertainty. A study was done by the McKinsey Group, and this is one of the things that they see out there. So what are the levels of uncertainties of the different businesses, and how do the different business owners feel about their uncertainty to return to business? 37% of them felt like, okay, I think we're in good order. We had a great risk management plan in place. 54%, that's the majority of the businesses out there, they're a little ambiguous. They're sitting on the edge. They're not sure. Our supplier is going to be there for us. Are we going to be there for our clients? They're kind of wait and see. They're going to just go in, start business and see how it goes. And then there is 9% that is in total chaos. So I want to merge this with level of impact. What's the level of impact from your uncertainty? So again, there is minor level of impact. So businesses' assumptions are valid. They made some assumptions. They had a good risk management plan. And in their risk management plan, they made some assumptions. So the uncertainty level of impact is minor. They're going to put in a few safety measures so that their staff can come back to work and they'll be ready to go. Then there is moderate. These are people who they had a risk management plan. However, they still have to make some significant changes to their business so that they will be able to come back to business and be able to function normally. That's 54% of the businesses that are out there. And then there is the last small percent, the 9%, major. This is the whole shutdown, the whole pandemic has had a huge impact on them. Business assumptions are no longer valid. So now they have to relook at their entire business and say, are we going to be here? Entire business strategy needs to be reevaluated. What exactly would they be doing as a business going forward in the new post-COVID-19 era? So I stop again just to look at risk treatment, because we've gone through risk identification, we've looked at the analysis, we've done the evaluation, and now we've decided that there are some businesses that are pretty certain about their way forward, so the risk was acceptable to them. But then there are some other businesses which the response was totally unacceptable, so they need to think about a risk treatment in terms of a response to what was unacceptable. So risk treatment is a risk modification process. It involves selecting and implementing one or more treatment options. And once this treatment option has been put into place, it becomes the new control. It literally becomes your new normal, and it modifies any existing controls that you might have had. So what are we thinking about risk treatment? The options you have from risk treatment, there are a few of them. You could completely avoid the risk. In this case, the pandemic. There was no way to avoid the pandemic. Remove the risk. Again, you couldn't remove the risk with the pandemic. But there were preventive things that could be done to be able to reduce transmission of the pandemic. Change the probability. How would it affect your business? Retain the risk. For some people, retaining the risk has actually been an opportunity. Reduce the risk. Again, this is for this particular pandemic, the whole area of hygiene, public health would help you reduce the risk to your business, the direct impact to your business and your staff. Modify the consequences of the risk. And then you could share the risk with others. In this case, I'm thinking about if you had an obligation that is due, these are some of the places where you'd have to share some of those obligation risks. Increase the risk to pursue opportunities. So again, there are companies that were never in the business of making face masks, but are actually going to be able to, they love the risk. Now they're able to get into a new business, which is making face masks. And that actually just helps them multiply their business. So levels of business change. What we have here is some 5 basic questions that I look at to prepare for the post-COVID-19 era. What is the new normal? So what's your destination? What's the destination that you're taking your business to? How do we get to the next normal? Do we have a plan? What is the plan you've put in place? Who is going to lead this plan? Do we have everything we need to get to the next normal? We need to spend some time looking at the resources. What resources do we need to have in place as we plan for our next normal. How do we measure our progress towards the next normal? What is progress? What does progress mean for us? What are the milestones? We need to be able to map out those milestones so that we can measure them. What threats or opportunities will we encounter on the way to the next normal? Again, we need to go back. We know what the destination is. We know what the plan will be, the plan we'll use to go on. We know what resources we need to have. We know how we're going to manage our, measure our progress. But also, again, we need to go back and do another risk management, identify the risk, evaluate them as we go forward into a new normal. So as I come to close to the end, the 3 R's for the post-COVID, this is around restart. How are you going to restart safely? What are the options you have? Some people are going to have to come in, do shifts. They're going to have to think about decongesting their workplaces. So what are the things that you need to do to restart your business? If you're completely shut down, how are you going to recover? How do you recover your business? How do you reach out to your network? Do you reach out to all your clients? How do you recover your business? And now you've restarted, you've recovered, and then you want to reinforce what are the learnings? What did you learn from going past the pandemic? You now want to build resilience to be able to address future disasters. Might not be another pandemic, it could be an earthquake. God knows what it could be. So post-COVID-19 organizations need to answer some really simple, some more simpler questions for me. Who we are. Every organization needs to know where its North Star is. Where exactly is the destination we're going to? How different are we from the other organizations? How are we going to create value for the people who come to do business with us? We need to rethink how we operate. We need to think about new power centers. One of the big challenges for a lot of organizations has been the hierarchy in decision makings. So some organizations will have to think about how they're going to operate going forward. How do we grow as an organization? This is a time to learn. So lots of organizations have had to do remote work. So they've had to learn how to do Zoom, for example. They've learned how to send out mails and how to be able to do other things remotely. So embracing data becomes a really big part of the post-COVID era. So at this point, I'd just like to acknowledge McKinsey and McKinnon and of course the associates at the Global Healthcare, and would stop and take some questions on risk management and your business post the COVID-19 era. Again, please feel free. You could drop us an email, phone call, Facebook, Twitter, and we'll be glad to address any questions, concerns you have. We'll be very glad to work with your organizations to go through some of these standards, help you come up with some risk management plans, and think about business continuity going forward. Again, if you have any questions, please just go into the chat box, type them in, and I'll do the best to be able to answer some of them at this time. There has to be somebody who has a question, I know. So just go on and ask it. Type it up. I see somebody is putting up their hands. Who is that now? Did they just put their hand back down? Hand has gone up. Why don't you just go on and test and see whether your microphone works? And just ask us a question, okay? What is the role of government in the resurrection of businesses? Well, again, this is a question that each government is going to have to deal with. And if, for example, if you're dealing with something like schools, for example, this is very important to the health of different governments. So they're going to want to support their schools, for example. They want to support hospitals. If there is a major private sector hospital in the area that is threatening to close because of the pandemic, I bet the government would certainly come in to be able to support them to stay open, because it has a direct impact on the health of the people and the health of the nation. So for different governments, they're going to have to make different decisions. I know, for example, in Uganda, where I am right now, in Kenya next door, a lot of the countries, or even in the United States, for example, the governments have given out checks to people, they've given food to people, they've asked the banks to be considerate in loans that people have taken. I know some countries have even gone as far as telling landlords not to be able to take rents from the tenants. So different governments are going to have to approach this from different points. And again, they'll have to look at what their total GDP is and what the impact of the decisions that they make would be on the GDP of countries. I hope that, I know there is no clear short answer I could give you what a government is going to do, but every government is going to do the best that they can to support their people through this crisis. But again, some businesses would just not come out of it, and those that would stay in and survive would actually get the chance of making a monopoly. Do I have another question there?
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah,
somebody's trying to mic.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, just appreciation for the presentation.
Oh, thank you. Is this Valentine Mangero?
Thank you so much. Just one concern, depending on, I'm just trying to wonder from the presentation you've given us, where is African nations? At what level of risk management do we see African nations? We realize now we are running in a total of about over 3,000 deaths. And when this pandemic started, most nations resolved to just move faster to close. And from the view of things, we realized that Africans are not able to continue to lock down. And so much is happening, and it is actually going to the other negative risk approach in almost all the nations. So where are we with the risk management in this? Or what would be the approach? As nations continue to lock down, I think we may end up now with a different issue or a different uncertainty as we move on with the issue of pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that question. That's a question that I have to deal with almost on a daily basis. I support a lot of governments going through this, and I have to answer this question all the time. How long are we going to stay locked down? And as I said from the very beginning, I think it was Nigeria in the last week of February was the first African country to shut down. But Nigeria has experience. Nigeria went through the Ebola crisis and very robust systems they have there. Senegal was the next country that went very quickly to do the lockdown. So this has been a situation where different governments have had to take some really important things into consideration. Number one, what is the extent of their capability to hospitalize people? And you must agree with me that our hospitalization infrastructures are not as strong as they're supposed to be. And so if a government has to ask that question as question number one, instantly, when the hospitalization capabilities are low, then the lockdown must be in place. Because should we have a huge amount of infected people who have to go into hospital, and we don't have hospitalization for those people, then what is going to happen is we're going to increase the potential for the people who are out. So that's one of the first considerations that the governments have to think about. The second consideration tests their people to be able to ascertain what is the level of infection in the country and quickly move to follow the contacts, and not only to follow the contacts, but quarantine the contacts. And the big thing around testing is, do the African governments have the commodities to be able to do testing at such huge numbers? And I'm talking about, I don't know of any government today that can test 25,000 people in a week. I don't know of any. So the lockdown has to be measured with how many tests can we do to be able to ensure that our total population can be understood, and understood quickly enough to be able to flatten the curve, as I said earlier on, so that we ensure that there are no new infections that we can. In Africa, we don't make any of the test kits. I know Senegal has just recently launched. I know Nigeria is also working on a home brewed test kit. I know Uganda is also brewed test kit. But so this is not the risk management plan for today. So if we just think about hospitalization, we think about testing, and we think about infection rates, we think about our ability to do contact tracing, those elements make it very incumbent on the governments at this time to really consider how fast they can lift the lockdown. But again, yes, the lockdown is not going to be the solution. That is very true. But I think the underlying solution to this is that the African governments will now start thinking, how are we going to address a future pandemic? And one of my very first suggestions is, how do we reinforce the pharmaceutical industry on the African continent? How do we put more money into research on the African continent? How do we follow the WHO recommendation and ensure that all our ministries of health actually budget at a required level of GDP, so that we can be sure that the level of health for these countries to respond to disasters is actually reasonable? So yes, it's going to be painful, but different countries will have to deal with this depending on their ability to manage hospitalization or testing and or new infection rates. Thank you. I think we have two more questions. Jackson Ware, if you would go on, Jackson.
Thank you very much, Prof, for that wonderful presentation. And the subject of discussion is very, very important. It's very, you've approached it very well. I was only wondering, being the person that is involved with the strategic Uganda Gulf Union management, and we had engaged a number of we have cross-country or inter-country tournaments that we usually host, and we had approached a number of sponsors, and this is my docket. What would be your advice on how to address or how to present one's case in this scenario post-COVID, where we know that a number of sponsors have been really supporting government efforts where government mobilized a number of companies to support during this pandemic. And so companies have committed resources in the fight against COVID and also supporting communities. Here is the dilemma. How do we craft a proposal that addresses and clearly demonstrates that risk assessment was fairly understood, but probably was not implemented at the earlier stages? Thank you.
You're asking me a question for government. I just say this, different governments have had to deal with this differently, and they've had to, there are lots of partners, you're very right, that are supporting a lot of countries, and there are individuals as well that are actually supporting a lot of countries out there, whether they're donating protective gear or they're donating test kits or they're donating food or water. There's so much going on in terms of support to the COVID. But I think, again, as I said earlier on, looking at it from a risk management perspective, I think the big thing here is the governments have had to answer a very important question. How ready are we for a pandemic of such a nature? And again, it could be a pandemic, it could have been a disaster, a natural disaster. We have floods in all the corners of the world. We have, if it's not a flood, it might be an earthquake. How many people are going to be dead from it? And I think one of the big questions for the African continent is, what kinds of collaborations do we have What is the network? So we talk about the SADC region, we talk about the East African community, we talk about ECOWAS. What is the relationship amongst these regional groups and what is their level of response? I'll give you a very simple example right now. If you take the case of the US, in spite of all the deaths that are happening, when New York had a big problem, there were other states that were willing to lend them ventilators. In the same country, there were other states that were willing to lend them ventilators. There were states that were willing to lend their nurses and their doctors to go up and help. So we need to be able to ensure that our regional bodies have these kinds of agreements so that if it is South Africa today, or it is Tanzania or Kenya or Senegal that has numbers that are growing, we should be able to ship whatever it takes into these countries within the region so that we can mitigate any potential negative fallout. Because again, we're talking about risk management, a negative fallout is not going to be good, A, for the country, or B, for the region, because each of these countries within the different regions have something that they bring to the table in the regions. So I think it's a learning process for the businesses, it's a learning process for the governments, but I think there is going to be a lot of discussions post-COVID-19, even at the government level. There is somebody, Casera, iPhone.
Yes, thanks so much for that wonderful presentation, sir.
Thank you.
What I would like to know, okay, what I would like you to clarify or assure us is that, are we really prepared for the lockdown? Okay, the lockdown has finally happened, but what measures are there to ensure that people get out of it and get back to normal? Are governments ready to put back everyone to normal as they were, or some things are going to change? So many people might lose jobs, you know. In the country where I come from, Uganda, so many people use borders and taxis. And as far as the situation is now, it's now that so many people are not going to turn back into those businesses. How are governments going to look into their after businesses after the pandemic? Thanks.
So I happen to be familiar with the case of Uganda. Let me just go straight into it and say, Uganda is doing a phased approach in lifting the lockdown. So I think it was his 14th press conference he had, the president was very clear about the return to school, the return of the private cars, the return of public transport. And public transport is a big thing in every country around the world, because the people in public transport in every country, they meet hundreds and hundreds of people in any one day, which means if anybody who is in the public transport business is infected, their chances of infecting more people is suddenly quadrupled, or if not quintupled. So it is very important that the area of public transport, in the case of Uganda, you refer to the border or the taxis. That is very important. But now, again, like all the other countries, we need to be able to measure the lifting of the lockdown, again, with two very, very important things. What is our ability to test? What is our ability to do the contact tracing? And what is our ability to hospitalize everybody who is found to be sick and needs intensive care? Those three things are really important when we talk about the lifting of the lockdown, because we do not want other diseases or other ailments to suffer. If you took, for example, you took one of your good hospitals in Uganda, and all of a sudden we've lifted everything up, and then there is a huge infection rate. What does that mean to a pregnant woman who has to deliver? It means she doesn't have a place to go to because the hospitals have been capacitated with COVID-19 infections. So we need to be able to take that into consideration as we lift the lockdown, so that we can still continue, or the governments can still continue to afford healthcare to the other people who have other diseases and other emergencies. It could be a road accident, a school bus on a road accident, 13 children badly injured, nowhere to go because the closest hospital is full with COVID patients. Why is it full with COVID patients? Because there was an abrupt lifting of the lockdown. So those are measures that government has to take into very serious consideration and slowly wean off the lockdown. I know it is very uncomfortable. I hear this question all the time. How long are we going to stay in the lockdown? Oh, how is business going to come? Very true, as I said in my presentation, some businesses are going to have a negative effect to the lockdown. This is the crisis part, and they're not going to come back. Some other businesses are going to have a positive effect to it, and they're going to come back stronger, and hopefully they can employ some of the people whose businesses had a negative effect. But again, one of the important things which I mentioned during my talk is this is a time for people to relearn. This is a time for people to learn new skills. This is a time for people to learn other areas in which they had not considered, because post-COVID, we're going to be in a new normal. It's going to be a new normal. As I said earlier on, there was an old normal. We've gone through chaos. In the period of chaos, people have to retool themselves. People have to reskill. Businesses are going to have to do the same thing. If a business was used to selling a 2-liter bottle of Coke, now they're going to have to consider selling a 500 ml liter of Coke, because the people no longer can afford the 2-liter bottle of Coke. That is going to have to be a change that businesses will have to make. So unfortunately, there are some businesses that are going to suffer. Government is going to do what government can do to support the businesses. But again, government is going to have to prioritize what businesses actually affect the citizens of the country and put the most amount of citizens out of harm's way before they can support them. So I think there's going to be a lot of learning, both for government and for businesses and for individuals as well. Thank you. Okay. We have room for one last question. Is there anybody with one last question? Again, all our videos, you could see them on YouTube. You could actually connect this particular video with our first video we did on business continuity. And there's a very great relationship with both of them. You could look at both of them in succession, and this should be able to help you with your businesses. I heard somebody saying something. Was there a question there? Well, I thank you all for joining, and I look forward to seeing you again next week, Monday. Every Monday, same time, I will be here with something new to discuss. So I welcome you back. If you have any questions, please, if you think of something later on, drop us a line. I will be very glad to get back to you. Always my pleasure. Have a wonderful rest of the week. Bye.